recording as well. You need to give me
Sure.
permission. Otherwise,
Got you. We should be fine.
okay, cool.
And we
Works for me.
should be live on YouTube now. So I see people are starting to trickle in. So I guess without further ado, welcome everyone to Policy Nerd Nights. First Policy Nerd Nights of the new year. Today's episode, if you will, is going to be about housing. We've got these wonderful speakers you're about to meet in a moment. Each of them has a really unique story and is super passionate with housing. So, I mean, Sarah, I don't know, anything else I got to say about Policy Nerd Nights, or should we just crack right into it?
Yeah, well, we, like Sean said, this is our first nerd night of the year. And we have, a social media presence and a website, and we'll plug those at the end of this podcast or at the end of this panel. But Sean, you introduced it wonderfully. So I'll let you go ahead and introduce our panelists as well.
Sure. So we have Brittany Kick. She is the Livermore City Council member. We also have Mohammed Almuddin. He is the Policy Associate at the Turner Center. And we also have congressional candidate in CA 32, Shervin Azami. And each of them is going to tell you a little bit about themselves. The way I see it right now, we'll start with Brittany.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Brittany Kick, and I am a council member in Livermore, California, which is the East Bay. So we're east of Oakland. And I am really passionate about housing. When I was a teenager, my family and I were housing unstable for a little bit. We were very lucky to only be housing unstable and not houseless. But, my mom was on her own with two teenagers, and it was a stressful time. And then as an adult, I really saw the cost of housing, even with the college education I was told to get, with the engineering partner that I was lucky to have in my life. And really learned the importance of cities in the whole process of making better housing decisions, so that no one has to go through a period of housing instability. So I'm a renter, which was strangely controversial when I ran for office. But I know that I am not the only one in the state, and I'm happy to represent young renters in my area. Thanks for having me.
Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Mohammed Almuddin, and I am very happy to be here with, especially, it's nice to find an elected that is a renter. So a little bit about my story of how I got into the housing space. Also, single mom, two teenagers, me and my brother. We were housing unstable, and then it got stable. And then when I attended actually my alma mater, which is Berkeley, I was unhoused for a couple of months, and then it took a lot to get back, get my get everything right. And now here I am at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. I'm the policy associate for the Turner Center. During this talk today, I'll be discussing the latest research from the Turner Center. And also, I will also be highlighting a few things from our Turner Labs. It's great to have the research and the data and the policy that we're supporting. At the same time, it's really important to have just like the innovative implementation on solving the housing crisis in California. Prior to the Turner Center, I also worked at California YIMBY and the Green Lining Institute. So I have a variety of perspectives to give to this panel, and I'm excited to be here. I'll pass it to Shervin.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. Very excited to be here with you. My name is Shervin Azami, and I'm a father, immigrant, and public health activist running for U.S. Congress in California's 32nd, which is in the city of Los Angeles, primarily the San Fernando Valley, but also now coastal communities like Malibu, Topanga, Pacific Palisades, and other areas of the west side of LA. I'm the son of two Iranian immigrants who fled religious persecution in Iran during the time of the revolution. Growing up, my mom worked in retail, making ends meet for the family, while my father went back to school to become a primary care physician. And I've always been an advocate for social justice through the lens of public health. And before running for office was legislative director for a national indigenous healthcare nonprofit, fighting to make sure the federal government honors its treaty obligations to tribal nations. I'm also a housing justice advocate, proud to be the only candidate in our race to sign the Homes Guarantee Pledge and refuse all donations from real estate developers. And I really got interested in housing policy during the time of the 2008 economic recession, when it was right before that my parents bought their first home, and then we went through a series of economic setbacks where my mom was on workers' comp, my dad was not being paid at work, and we were receiving foreclosure notice after foreclosure notice. And as a teenager, I was writing letters to Wells Fargo urging them to not foreclose our home. And we were one of the lucky ones. And I remember back then thinking how asinine it was that the word luck was associated with something as basic a need as housing. And so proud to be running on a Homes Guarantee Housing for All platform, and very excited to talk about what's happening here locally in LA, and the kinds of policies that I'll be fighting for at the national level to ensure that we realize housing as a human right.
Thank you, Sherman, and all of you for these powerful words. So let's just dive into it. Obviously, housing is a massive issue, and across the world, and especially in, as we know, in California. So we're going to start with just saying, okay, if you could pick the top 3 issues, boil it down, of housing in California, in no particular order, what would they be? Anyone's welcome to start.
I'll start. I only have one that I'm going to say right now, and then maybe my co-folks here, I don't know what we are, panelists, co-panelists here can add some more. From my perspective in a city, the thing that I think that we need to pay attention to the most is actually how much power cities have over housing development, and how often suburban cities that are mostly led by wealthy white people are pushing the excuse after excuse that housing is a state issue and there's nothing that they can do, when really cities do have a lot of power. And the word NIMBY, not in my backyard, comes from these suburban developments where the local elected leaders are incentivized oftentimes to keep housing stock low, not only because they're homeowners themselves, but what I see a lot of, and was very surprising to me when I came into public office, is that a lot of times in these small cities, you don't have people who are looking to climb the political ladder, but they are in real estate. That is their profession. And the fact that that is not considered a conflict of interest when they are voting on how much housing stock to create, when it's literally, yes, the idea that we get handouts from developers. I have yet to see a bribe as a council member, so maybe other people get bribes and I just don't. But I think there is just this idea that when your work is tied to low housing stock and high housing prices as real estate agents or as real estate developers, it's hard to really not notice that as a conflict of interest. So paying attention to those down ballot races really matters. So that's my plug.
I'm happy to go next if that's okay with you, Mohammed. For me, it feels like a confluence of 2 factors, kind of looking at it from the national perspective and trends across the last few decades. And to me, it's a combination of the financialization or commodification of housing in tandem with chronic underfunding of public housing from government agencies, from the federal government down to state and local. And when you combine those issues, when you see all this exponential growth in real estate as an investment, as opposed to a basic human need, we start seeing these systems where instead of the government providing necessary funding to ensure that this foundational need is met, we're seeing more and more people collateralize housing and try to make a profit. And that undergirds so much of the issues we have here in our communities. And then on top of that, when the natural result of this process is more and more people falling through the cracks, falling into homelessness, the response is not empathy and compassion and building new housing. The response is criminalization. And I want to share just a few statistics about how this issue has become so much worse over the last decade and a half, basically since the Great Recession. From 2009 to 2019, so the year after the crash, the year before the pandemic, median rent increased by roughly 36% nationwide. I'll share the stats for LA and San Francisco in a minute because they're exponentially higher, but nationwide median rent increased by 36%. Median home resale prices equivalent about 35%. Compare that to wages. Median household income increased by only 15% in that same time period. So all this inflation in housing, yet people have less purchasing power in their pockets to afford that basic need. Here in LA, rent went up 65% in that same time period. Home prices went up 96%, and wages only went up by that same 36% threshold. So again, what we're seeing as a result, more and more people falling into poverty and not being able to afford these basic needs. And the result has been that here in the wealthiest nation of the history of the world, more and more people are falling through the cracks, and we're not seeing our officials stand up and fight back against institutional Wall Street investment into this basic need. And instead, because their campaigns are financed by these same entities, there's no incentive for them to actually work with and for their communities to ensure we're addressing the shortage of nearly 4 million housing units we have nationwide.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you. I'm really appreciating what you just highlighted, Shervin. And wow. So let me start with what I think are like the three most important things when it comes to the housing crisis right now. Right now is access, right? Like people's access to housing. You have a felony on your record, it shows up on your credit score for 7 years. It's almost impossible to find a home if you're formerly incarcerated. Deposits for rent are like twice the price of rent or 3 times. At the same time, it's like our access we're more segregated than we were in 1964, right? And the reason for that is that after the Fair Housing Act passed in California and later in the federal level, a lot of these local areas, which Brittany highlighted, changed their zoning. So they said only single family homes because people of color can't afford them. That's the racial justice lens to this. So how do we solve this problem, right? When it comes to access, and when California is short 4 million homes because we have been undersupply since the 70s. Apartments are banned in 80% of urban areas, urban lands. We need to really focus on infill development, not building out to wildfire zones, not building out so you have a 2-hour commute wherever you go, but building right there in walkable communities in cities so you could take a bike. I think if you bike within 3 miles of where you live, like any 3-mile trip, you trade it with a bike ride, you save like 50% of your emissions in the top 25 metropolitan areas in California. I mean, in the nation, which shows that the climate and housing crisis are interrelated. Also, because of the lack of supply, we have this overcrowding of housing, especially in Los Angeles and San Francisco. So that when things happen like a pandemic and your roommates go out and they come back and you suddenly get COVID, or if your family could only afford this like 2-bedroom home and there's 8 of you, disease spreads and more people get sick, and then we fall into the healthcare system, which is a whole thing that we could talk about. And I know Shervin knows a lot about specifically. Lastly, I think that when we pass more housing laws, especially when it comes to SB 9 or ADUs, the financial sector isn't financing right? Like we're legalizing things for the first time in 40 years. So that only people that have cash on hand could build an ADU. We really need to make it easier for people to have like 30-year loans, 30-year mortgage loans, 3% interest to build an ADU in the back. So then grandma can live in the back, and then you don't have to go get daycare. Grandma could supply that, and you save like a person's whole income. Intergenerational housing is something that's very important for people of color. At the same time, if you're only letting people with cash finance these ADUs, you're actually expanding the racial wealth gap. So the financial sector needs to catch up, and that takes a lot of innovation when it comes to the housing sector in general, which is very important to the Turner Center. Housing innovation, we haven't really changed the way we've thought about building or thought about financing or anything when it comes to the housing sector for like 100 years. So yeah, that's my spiel. It's access to housing, increasing the supply, and fostering innovation in the financial and building sectors.
Wonderful. Amazing answers. Thank you three so much for providing perspectives that I think a lot of us can relate to, but also that a lot of us had never considered. So one thing that I think most, if not all three of you mentioned was, housing as it relates to like local, state, and federal policy and funding, etc. I'd like to build kind of a strong foundational understanding in this room right now of what roles local, state, and federal government even play in housing, because there's a lot of private, there's a lot of developers, there's a lot of policy, there's a lot of, lobbying and campaigning. Can you guys kind of better explain what the role of local, state, and federal governments are when it comes to housing cost and supply, etc.?
I'll start on this, and just to give some basic understanding. So cities can do a lot, but the two things that you'll hear a lot about in California specifically is RHNA, which is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And the RHNA does not require you to build housing. It requires you to zone for housing. And zoning is something that happens I know a lot of the panelists, and I know that a lot of people viewing are like, yeah, we know this, but I'm going for the people that have no idea what's happening with housing, and I'm trying to do baseline here, right? So a general plan is this guiding document that goes, for about 2 to 3 decades, depending on your city, and it takes care of all your zoning. And so when a city goes through a general plan update, they can choose how to zone. And when we have single family zoning, it decreases housing supply, and it also decreases housing choice and diversity within neighborhoods. So the RHNA numbers come out from the state, and they say, okay, Livermore, you need to build, I don't have my numbers memorized. My meeting's tomorrow. I haven't finished reading the packet. So everybody give me a break, but we're going to do some fake numbers here. Livermore, you need to build 4,800 units. And so we say, okay, so we're going to zone for 4,800 units, or maybe our community is going to zone for a little bit more than that because we think we can do better. And we zone for those units by adding more apartments near a transit-oriented development, because hopefully we will have Valley Link joining us in a couple of years. And so that's what we're doing. We're going to be building up instead of out, because we do value our open space, right? And so all we have to do is zone for it. We don't have to come up with the money to build that housing. That is on the developer and on the state to find money to build the housing that we zone for. But what cities often do is they say, it's impossible. We can't possibly build 4,800 units. There's nothing we can do. We're going to have to sue, which many cities are in the Tri-Valley, and say it's impossible to build that many units, so we're just not gonna. And there's nothing you can do to make me. And it's true that the state does not have an arm to be able to hold cities accountable for not zoning for their RHNA numbers. And so you'll hear a lot of cities complaining right now that the state's going to spend $5 million on tracking if we're actually zoning or not. And maybe they're going to slap fines, or I don't know exactly how they're going to keep track, because I'm not worried about our city because we're doing what we're supposed to. But the reality is suburban cities are getting nervous that they are going to have to keep their commitments that they made to build housing numbers. And this process is kind of convoluted, and the RHNA process for the first time ever took into account something called underhousing. So usually it's just how many people are unhoused and how many people do we think might be moving here, or how many jobs do we expect in your community, and that's how many houses we're going to build. This time, the RHNA numbers allocation, or regional housing numbers allocation, took into account underhousing. So if you had more than two human bodies per bedroom, and not bedroom, room of a house. So a room is a kitchen. No, not a kitchen. A room is a living room, dining room. Anything but a kitchen and a bathroom counts as a room in a house, so not even just a bedroom. So if you had 6 rooms in a house and 12 people living in it, that was okay. If you had 6 rooms in a house and 15 people living in it, that was considered underhousing. And so those people that are underhoused were considered as a part of the need. And really, this was the first time I feel that RHNA took racial justice into account, because we know that people of color are more likely to live in more crowded housing situations due to the high burden and cost of housing in the area. And so my favorite thing to bring up is when people complain that the RHNA numbers are just too dang high, is to remind them that this is the first time we are considering underhousing, and we are truly taking into account the fact that people of color have been disproportionately affected by redlining and housing policy, and that they are more likely to be underhoused, not just unhoused, but also underhoused. And remind them that, yes, we do need to do better, and that they can build up. The sky is not going to fall if we build 4 stories instead of 1.
I also want to bring up Brittany, because it's a panel. I don't want us just to give speeches. Like, I know if you're allowed to comment, and you can just totally avoid this if you want, what's going on with the affordable housing complex with Eden Housing and like the city of Livermore. Because I know you could go into that.
Oh, I could. So this is something that happens where the city is doing everything that they possibly can. And so I'm just going to talk about a housing project. I don't know who's building it or who's suing. Just let's do a magical a what if. So what if a city decided they wanted to build 150, 130 units of affordable housing in their downtown core, but other people didn't like it? What could they do to stop it? And sometimes what people do is they will use CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, as a sword. So the California Environmental Quality Act is supposed to protect our environment, to make sure that we're not building willy-nilly, we're not building out into wildfire areas. That's not actually what it's for, even though I think it should be. We're not building out into endangered species areas, so that we're not destroying our planet by providing housing for the humans that are here, right? The reality is, a lot of times, rather than being a protection for the environment, it becomes a sword against developers who are trying to do the right thing and build affordable transit-oriented housing. And they will argue that it's bad for the environment. So even though there's nothing on the land except for a dirt parking lot, that it's unsafe to build housing there because whatever reason they come up with. And so what will happen is not that the cities are intimidated by people who literally own the media and then push these silly lawsuits. What will happen is they will sue, and that will prevent those developers from getting housing money from the state. So if a developer was planning to build something and they were in the middle of a CEQA lawsuit, they could not take state money to build that housing, which would mean it wouldn't pencil anymore, and they just couldn't build. And so basically what a lot of these groups are hoping when they use CEQA as a sword is that they push out funding so far that they give up. and they say, all right, we'll go build somewhere else then, which is really the not in my backyard argument, right? It's not that we're against affordable housing. We just don't want it on this dirt parking lot because whatever. So I don't know exactly what's going on with Eden. I'm not sure I'm allowed to comment on that, but if there was some sort of thing happening, that might be how it would go.
Yeah. Definitely. Okay, I had to touch that possible scenario because it happens so often in California. You get the RENA numbers, you zone it, and then let's say you want to build affordable housing. We have a Turner paper that says that the average affordable housing build takes like 6 capital sources, 6 to 8. So you have to stack them on top of each other. Each capital source takes an extended period of time. And so imagine trying to get 6 funding sources to fund one affordable housing complex, and then someone does a lawsuit and prevents it, and they could prevent it as much as they want anonymously and as many times as they want. And this is a big problem, is that like you could pass things at the state and local level, you could get the RENA numbers right, but then you have to actually build the buildings. And then there's this framework of basically stopping people from building like desperately needed affordable housing because they're worried about their property values. And then there's other cases where like so the Turner Center, we're civil servants, we're employed by UC Berkeley. We're here to provide data for solving the housing crisis. No one reads, not enough people read our research. A lot of politicians think something's a great idea, and then they try to pass it, and it's like, whoa, wait, read. We spent a year researching this with like the top people in the field. Like we have like, here's our breakdown on certain things. We had this paper on SB9, which was this bill that basically changed some lots in California to not be single family homes, so duplexes, and people thought that everything was going to be built everywhere. And we published a study that said, around 1% of the housing supply will be able to build more, but because of how much it costs to build, the wait time and everything, maybe 700,000 units, it's marketably feasible to build like a duplex, or to do a split lot. And then, market feasibility doesn't mean housing. So let's say even half of that, we build maybe 300,000 split lots, and that would take 10 to 20 years. So it wasn't like the end of the world. We were just opening up the housing situation. There's a lot of research like this. Like people think we could convert all of our commercial lands and suddenly solve the housing crisis, commercial to residential. We published 2 papers on adaptive reuse. Believe it or not, most of the commercial spaces that were built didn't have people living there in mind. So they don't follow any of the building codes if you want people to live there. On top of that, if you look at data of where commercial can be converted to residential, most localities don't do it because like most developers in these localities don't do it because basically it's like it doesn't pencil out. It's better just to tear down the thing and then rebuild. So we have 2 papers on that. If you want to be a policy nerd and learn about housing, go on the Turner Center's website. Your tax dollars help pay for this, and you could read so much about this. There's 18,000 people in the Bay Area that pay 80% of their income to housing. They have $300 left. How are we going to help them and prevent them from becoming unhoused? Because it's really hard for personal experience for someone to be unhoused to be rehoused again. How do we increase wages in a way that prevents people from being displaced? It's not just housing supply. We also have to look at the stagnation of wages. We have to look at multiple things within our society to help solve this housing crisis. And I see challenge accepted. Thank you for accepting that challenge. You can always reach out to me. And yeah, I'll pass it to Shervin or Brittany or whoever wants to talk more. I know I took up a lot of mic time.
No, it's an incredible conversation. I mean, the short answer to the role the federal government has in housing is substantial, enormous. I mean, we all know, as we've talked about, the federal government is almost single-handedly responsible for institutionalizing the racial wealth gap for decades and decades through redlining policies. And as Mohammed alluded to, Even though we had the Fair Housing Act passed 50 years ago, the gap between Black and white homeownership is higher now than it was during the time of Martin Luther King. And this week we just celebrated that holiday. And so, thinking about, especially coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we all saw the headlines last year where after Congress appropriated around $46 billion for rental assistance, it took months and months and months for that funding to trickle down. And even to this day, it's still not fully being spent. And despite that, the eviction moratorium, as we know, was struck down by the Supreme Court. Most states, including here in California, haven't had the moratorium in place for a long time. But again, we have to look at how chronic underfunding at the federal level leads to austerity within state and local governments. Just to give you some numbers on this, in fiscal year 2021, the full budget for the Department of Housing Urban Development was at roughly $49 billion. That was 3.5% of total discretionary spending by the federal government. Discretionary meaning the annual spending Congress always works on through the appropriations process. Compare that to the fact that the same year, we had a $740 billion military budget. I mean, one of the main points of our campaign is that here in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, poverty is a policy choice and our budgets reflect our values. And when we look at the federal share of funding for housing, it has dropped when adjusted for inflation over the past couple decades. You look at programs like Section 8 housing voucher. Right now, only 1 out of every 5 families eligible are able to receive it because of that chronic underfunding. But across all these programs, their funding has dropped. As a percentage of GDP, funding for housing was around 1.4% back in the 70s. Now it's 0.23%. So again, as a result of all these policies and the failure to really comprehensively and proactively solve these problems by investing in housing and giving folks the tools at the local level to build public housing, by passing policies like banning exclusionary zoning at the federal level and withholding funds from local governments that still have exclusionary zoning, we don't have politicians that are willing to do that. And so a lot of the issues that Mohammed and Brittany are talking about stem from that austerity at the federal level.
I just want to jump in and talk about, I asked, I am not a career politician person. I was a mom who was in a pandemic and met a council person and was like, this is cool. Can you teach me? And then decided to run, right? So I knew nothing and I invested time and learned how to be an advocate. And when I went in, I said, how come we just don't have like housing that is, that we build and we own and we charge rent as the city, because we own land as the city. Why can't we do that? Seemed like a great idea. And the answer was not, oh, we can't do that because, poor people or, all the horrible NIMBY things I was expecting. The answer was, we don't have support from the federal government to do that, because it would take, when you really do think about it, like our city staff is already understaffed just based on the reality of the workforce right now, but you have to have people live in those buildings, run the programs. So it makes more sense to encourage these nonprofits like Eden Housing to come in and manage those projects, unless we have substantial investment from the federal government to give to municipalities to build out housing programs. Even if cities have all the best intentions in the world, they don't have unlimited funding and staff, and they have to pick and choose where are their dollars going to go farther. And supporting these nonprofits is how it's going to go farther right now. But cities have less control over how fast something gets done when they have to find 6 different funding sources to build. So they're kind of doing what they have to. But if there was federal investment, that could be different.
And on that topic, just really quickly to add to it, one of the biggest impediments to federal financing for housing is something called the Fair Cloth Amendment that's been on the books since the latter years of the Clinton administration. It basically barred federal financing for construction of new public housing units beyond their 1999 levels. It's 2022. So for over 2 decades, we've seen no real investment in building new public housing from the federal government. And on top of that, they have cut funding for capital improvements for existing public housing. And so the existing stock is experiencing huge maintenance issues. It's has lead, toxic chemicals, is run down. And instead of financing new construction, we're not even putting up the money to fix the existing public housing projects. I mean, you look at the Build Back Better Act, which now could be aptly called Build Back Barely if it ever even passes. But I mean, you had all these politicians that were saying, $150 billion for housing, huge investment. Well, about $65 billion of that was just going to capital improvements for existing housing stock, which is necessary. But again, we're not being proactive at actually putting the money in to build public housing that we need to prevent homelessness, to ensure that we're taking care of the at least over 500,000 people across the country that are unhoused on any given night. Here in LA County, 66,000, in the city, over 44,000. And so again, it goes back to these decisions made by policymakers in Congress, not because of the needs of their constituents, because of who was financing their reelection campaigns.
And I really want to expand on a lot of these points, especially Shervin's right. I mean, the population's only grown since 1990, and America's only gone poorer, well, the average American, since 1990. And yet we still have the same housing supply, except none of it's been updated. And no new housing has been built. And then when you go to housing choice vouchers, otherwise known as Section 8, I think Los Angeles is an 11-year waiting list. You're waiting for just housing, for a possibility of housing. And then I know, because of my previous experience in different areas, especially when it came to the racial justice space, there's people that get approved for a Section 8 voucher, and then just waiting for someone to do a property inspection takes a week. And then sometimes the landlord is just going to lock out the building and not show up, even though that's illegal, but there's no enforcement of that. There's actually no legal enforcement or enough legal enforcement. I can't say absolutes, enough legal enforcement or tenant protections when it comes to the state, federal, or local level in most places. I also wanted to expand that with Build Back Better, there was a lot of money going to housing choice vouchers. There's also place-based vouchers, which is the development of more through like LIHTC and such, low-income housing tax credit. Basically, Project Room Key, Project Home Key gets a lot of its funding from the federal level. It put $1 billion to that. That might not get passed. California is very dependent on that funding to keep this program going, so people don't have to sleep on the streets during a pandemic. There's a lot of problems, as you can see, at the state level. So imagine if you get more funding in the federal level. At the state level, we passed this constitutional amendment. It was a proposition. It's called Article 34. And it bars localities from building, owning, or I think renting affordable housing, unless voters approve it at a 66% vote, which is as much as Newsom's won the election, but you get 1% of people to be like, I don't want affordable housing near my house. It suddenly doesn't pass, which is a huge barrier when it comes to affordable housing developers, because they can't get a lot of sources from the city, more than 50%. So they can't get more than 50%. So they have to keep capital stacking. The legislature passes something every 2 years trying to repeal it as a proposition, because propositions could either be through signatures or through an act of the legislature. We do not have a millionaire or a billionaire to run the proposition on the ballot for not even Article 34 repeal, but to bring down that voter threshold from 66% to 55%. So really we're at the whims of some billionaire who wants to fund a proposition for us to hopefully build affordable housing if voters want to build it at the state level for localities. It's a mess, and it's all rooted in racism and wanting to increase property values. And all of this started in the 60s and 70s because we just didn't want brown or black people to live next to us, as white homeowners would like to say. And their property values across the state has increased exponentially. The homeowner has no incentive because their property taxes are frozen through Prop 13, which that's a whole different discussion. Basically, so now the median home costs $800,000 in California. Who could afford that? Where's the next generation going to live? It's not just affordable housing, it's also market rate housing. We don't build any housing in California, and we're gentrifying the state. If you look at the numbers, it's mostly low to moderate income people leaving the state. It's not rich people. There's actually more rich people moving into the state. That's why we have this budget surplus. It's one of the many reasons why I have a budget surplus. We're gentrifying the whole state of California. Before, we were sending them to the inland or to Central Valley. They can't afford that anymore. They're moving to other states. So this is a huge problem.
So I just want to jump in really quick and say that our city recently just approved, it's not really approving, we accepted the opportunity to apply for a grant where we're partnering with other cities to get a grant to buy some homes and turn them into temporary housing shelters. So I wish it was permanent, but it's better than nothing. I looked at the numbers and I can do math, but it was a sad math moment for me to realize that we were asking for $5 million, but we were only going to buy 3 houses. That is a problem. That's how much housing costs in a suburban area out in Livermore, because you have to buy a house that's big enough to have multiple rooms that you can convert. So if you start by buying a 5-bedroom home, which is about 1.6 in this area, $1.6 million for a 5-bedroom home. And then you can convert the other rooms into, closed door rooms so people have some privacy. But the reality is that's what we're going to apply for. We can't just build our own house and make it cheaper. It would take too long. People need housing right now. And that was a really, really hard moment for me to swallow and be like, well, of course I'm going to approve applying for this grant, but why can it only be 3 homes? There has to be a better way. And I appreciate that some cities are like, we're doing what we can. We'll take what we can get. But we need support from various other levels of the government to say one of the things my thought would be, what if with Prop 13, we had an incentive for you to sell your home to a project like this? So for example, if you sell your home, you are going to end up paying taxes on the value of the home when you sell it, right? Where if you keep it, you're just paying the property tax on basically nothing. But if we incentivized people being able to sell their homes to projects like these, then we allow the rich white people to be the hero, which they love doing, but at least it could help solve a little bit of a problem, right? So if we said, if you choose to sell your home, which you bought for $20,000 in 1960, to this project at the rate, maybe at twice what you paid for it, or 3 times what you paid for it, but not 10 times what you paid for it, then we'll lower your tax burden on that sale, because it's going to a project like creating temporary shelter. And so there are ways that we can be creative, because there's a bunch of housing stock that no one paid $1.6 million for, but that they could sell it for right now. And so instead we're buying that home at market rate, when we have the opportunity to provide incentive to let people right some of the wrongs of our past.
Just to jump in on this really quickly, a willingness among our policymakers to actually be creative in policy making to address these problems is necessary. And, folks like you, Brittany, give me a lot of hope. And I wish we had more people like that down here in LA. I'm going to take this opportunity to jab local politicians based on what Mohammed said earlier about how we're not even sheltering folks during the pandemic. Well, one good thing President Biden did within the first week or so of entering office was authorize FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to provide state and local governments 100% federal reimbursement to shelter folks in hotels for the duration of the pandemic. Not a permanent solution, right? But just giving people a roof over their heads during a public health crisis that is disproportionately impacting communities of color and low-income communities, especially our unhoused neighbors. I mean, just last year alone in the city of LA, we had at least 1,500 unhoused folks die, at least. The city of LA never asked for that money. Mayor Garcetti and City Council President Neri Martinez never actually requested those FEMA funds, free federal monies, just to make sure folks do not die during a pandemic. And not a single federal representative here in LA said a word about it. And that speaks to that gap between federal policy makers and state and local, and not actually working together to address these issues. So just wanted to throw that out there as additional context around how, we're not only are we not solving the problem, we're actively worsening the problem through the policies that our current politicians are pushing forward.
I want to give, I saw Sean pop in. You could pop back in, Sean. Sorry.
I know.
Yeah,
we,
I
we
wanted to
kept
get-
talking over you.
Yeah, you guys touched upon the sort of market perspective earlier, and this gets into a question I think we had earlier in chat. Why is it we're not seeing the housing being developed? Is it some kind of lack of developers? Are they building the wrong thing? Is it not affordable housing? What's going on exactly? I'm not sure which of you would like to speak to that.
Mohammed, you seem excited. You want to kick us off?
Yeah. Let's grapple with this question. It's a lot, right? So, and thank you so much for asking this question, Sean. When it comes to development in California, okay, let's go back to the recession. The recession knocked out a lot of developers. There's only like a few big players that can develop buildings right now. Most of them are not community-based, right? As you can imagine. Becoming a developer is almost impossible, especially for BIPOC communities. I think 2% of developers are Black. It's abysmal how few developers there are. There's barely any developers of color who are like from these communities that want to build, right? So we have that problem. We don't have enough people, so then there's less competition in the market, as you can imagine. Prices are higher. And no one can really, if you want a construction worker to build something in the Bay Area or in Los Angeles, they can't afford to live in these places. So they drive 2 to 3 hours each way. No one wants to do that. So you have that problem. The next problem is that local governments are very hesitant for legalizing apartments on a lot of the land, and also missing middle housing options. Missing middle is basically a duplex, a triplex, anything up to like just 10 units. That's easier to finance, easier for these developers, these want to be developers to basically build and enter the market and start growing their businesses. That's pretty much illegal. You would see them because a lot of them were built before 1970 with all the zoning laws. These cute little cottage clusters, so like little cottages near each other, you can live with your friends, to like apartments, very famous in Berkeley, little apartments in backyards, like these options. Actually, you own land and like you pay a mortgage, you own a land and you can't use it because the Republicans never hopped on this. Like you pay all this money and then like you can't use the land for anything. The HOA stops you, the government stops you. It's like, you really own the land. But that's not a Turner position. That's a Muhammad position.
How libertarians are not like super pro SB9 just baffles me.
Right? Yeah. Anyway, so you have a lack of developers. It's illegal to build. It's very hard to finance because there's none of these housing financing options. There's a lot of things that can be changed with GSEs, which I've used the acronym so much I don't even know government's sponsored. I don't remember. Someone Google it and put it in the chat. GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, these sort of government sponsored entities. Thank you. Just when it comes to just banks like lending out for like these different kinds of housing types, it's really hard. And then lastly, at the local level, we have these wild requirements to build anything. You have to have your enterprises. Yeah, thank you. You have to have a parking space for everything that's built, even if it's in a very walkable and transit-rich community. There's a setback. Your house has to be back a certain amount. You have to have a backyard. You have to have this much in the side. There's just these, and some of these requirements, I mean, when cities try to skirt around SB9, the duplex law, you have like Los Altos that's like, hey, if you want to split your lot, and it has to be affordable housing, and if it's affordable, it has to be behind a shrub. So they set the size of a shrub that has to be there so people don't see it on the street. Los Altos is one of the richest places in California. And like there's these wild requirements that are being passed at the local level that make it really hard to build any housing. So just to boil it down, barely any developers, really hard to get into the market. Zoning, legalities was missing middle, financing is not there, and local government's making it harder and harder. They maybe prolong permits, they do anything that they could do to make it more difficult to build housing at the local level. And there's good actors like Brittany that want to help people, but then how do you turn back 50 years of like NIMBYs? And then you're going to have people calling, you have to have the whole council behind it. It's very difficult. So yeah, that's the challenge.
Yeah, so I was just gonna, you just jogged my memory about some things that are happening. So being a good actor is really difficult because especially in these suburban areas, this is just something that I always try and let people know. There are two different kinds of city governments. So there's a council manager government, and then there is a strong mayor government. And so in strong mayor governments like Oakland, the mayor is the one making all of the decisions. In a council manager government, we are like the board of directors, and the city manager is the executive director that is enacting the policies that we create. And oftentimes in these council manager governments, we have people that are less interested in like moving up the political ladder and more interested in controlling their own communities. But the reality is it's very difficult to be in office in these local positions if it's a council manager relationship, because oftentimes we aren't paid. And so like right now, I make $980 something a month to be a council person in a council manager government because a mayor previous decided that we don't need raises and we don't need healthcare because we all have pensions. So let's save the city money by making it illegal to pay us more than like $1,000 a month because we don't need it. And so that keeps people of color, keeps renters, keeps people that aren't wealthy and retired out of office. And this is super common in these suburban neighborhoods. So you don't see a lot of young people like me in these positions because it's not sustainable. And I know that it's not sustainable for me forever, but it's my turn right now. And that I think local government is a team sport, and that hopefully I'll have a teammate that I can queue up to run again another time, because we each need to take our turn. But the reality is that we don't see a lot of diversity in representation is not just because young people don't care or young people don't get it. And you see a lot of diversity in other cities. So like a Berkeley City Council member that has the same job as I do makes $65,000 a year, and I make 12, right? So I have to have another job and a partner to care for things, all other things. So that's just a little thing, FYI, people. That's happening in your communities. And if I wanted to change it, I'd have to get 65% of the vote. So that's never going to happen in this community. So whatever, that's fine. But what I was going to say is that we have good actors in Livermore, but there are still things where we approved apartments downtown that were affordable, and then we approved market rate housing right next to where that affordable housing is going to be, but the construction stopped, not because we did anything or not because there was a lawsuit, but because the construction company went bankrupt because the cost of construction is so high. And that isn't something that we have any control over as a policymaker. And it's also interesting because what will happen is in these arguments about who should build and why and when, oftentimes you know, that like meme of Spider-Man pointing at each other, and it's like we're blaming and pointing at who else's fault it is. And a lot of times union construction workers get blamed. So, oh, they want these high costs to build housing, and so it's their fault that housing is so expensive. Or the developer just wants too many profits, so it's their fault that the cost of housing is so high. But the reality is that all of these things play in together. And so, you know, I don't want a construction worker to be, you know, working under the table in unsafe conditions without unionized labor. But I also know that to pay somebody a living wage in the Bay Area, it's going to cost a lot more to build housing, which is why we need that federal money and support, so that we can do right by our construction workers, to pay them to live where they work and to be invested in their own communities. And then if something happens, like a construction company goes bankrupt, there are other processes that kept us from keeping building. There was a lawsuit they had to go through to get a new construction company, and then there were all these barriers to just keep moving. And I know those apartments are going to be ridiculously overpriced, but at least people that can afford it are going to come spend their tax dollars in that walkable downtown. So I do think that we do need all sorts of options. Another thing that you reminded me of was those little cottages and duplexes. If you're like in downtown Livermore, you will see so many of those, but they were all built pre 1970. And so when communities say like, oh, we don't want that, they already have them. They're just in their older parts of town. And so we know what it looks like, the fear of like, what's going to happen if all of a sudden we start, allowing development. We know what it looks like. Go to your part of town that was built pre 1970. That's what it's going to look like. So it's this fake fear of a monster that isn't a monster. We already have it.
And I mean, as we've always talked about, and as Brittany just mentioned, that austerity at the federal level, but kind of building off of that too, as I mentioned earlier, the financialization of the housing industry also undergirds a lot of the issues that we're facing. I mean, let's think back to what actually caused the Great Recession. It was real estate. It was Wall Street investors that were taking these subprime mortgages, bundling them together that had high rates of default and selling them off, creating this gigantic bubble that led to the greatest crash since the Depression. And since then, the response has been that we give Wall Street even further, opening the floodgates to have these institutional investors swoop in, buy single family homes, buy rental units for pennies on the dollar, flip them, and exponentially increase prices. I mean, here in Los Angeles, over 2/3 of multifamily housing are owned by institutional investors. These are not your mom and pop folks. That's a mythical thing that no longer really exists. These are corporate landlords and Wall Street firms like BlackRock and Blackstone. And, some folks want to say, well, it's still only, about 2% of the entire housing industry nationwide that's owned by Wall Street firms. The fact is, it's been growing exponentially over the past decade. Just last year, in the third quarter, 20% of all homes that were bought by Wall Street investors. BlackRock just 2 years ago made $7 billion on the roughly 80,000 rental units they own nationwide. So it's a growing share of these investor portfolios to put their money into housing. And those same mortgage-backed securities that led to the crash in 2008, all we did is replace them with rent-backed securities. The same issues, the same high risk of default. And we're just recreating the problem under a new light, repackaging it, and not actually solving it with the real investment we need.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys so much for your thoughts there. So moving on, we have spent a good amount of time talking about the issues, and I'm sure we could go on and on and on. But let's talk a little bit about the solutions, shall we? We have some very productive members of the community on the panel today. We have researchers, city council members, and congressional candidates. So my question for all of you, and we'll start with Shervin, is how can we implement changes to improve the state of housing through policy? And I'd love if you could focus on one particular policy that has gained a lot of traction over the last couple of years, which is universal basic income, because I'm sure that many people who struggle with housing, it's for financial reasons. And universal basic income is money in your wallet every month, no questions asked. So how can we, what current existing policies would you like to see either changed or taken out? What new policies would you like to see implemented? And if you could, please make a comment on universal basic income. I'd love to hear from all of you. Let's start with Shervin.
Yeah, absolutely. So the one that immediately comes to mind, I mentioned this earlier, we have to repeal the Faircloth Amendment. That amendment has barred federal financing for construction of new public housing since 1999. We have to repeal that amendment. We also have to ban exclusionary zoning at the federal level and withhold federal funds from local governments that still practice exclusionary zoning. We also need to pass a federal tenant bill of rights and ensure that landlords aren't evicting folks based on their source of income, based on whether their sexual orientation or their gender identity, based on their criminal history. We also need to ban things like no-cause evictions, no-fault or one-strike evictions. These are some of the policies that we absolutely need, in addition to ensuring that all of the existing federal housing programs are transformed into an entitlement and are fully funded. UBI is absolutely necessary as part of that mix, with making housing a human right, passing single-payer healthcare, and so much more. Because as you said, Sarah, it's putting money in people's pockets. When we saw the child tax credits go out, when we saw those stimulus payments go out, people use them for rent. People use them for food. People use them for childcare, for those basic needs. So absolutely, we got to put money in the hands of people through UBI and through living wages indexed to inflation and cost of living in tandem with building public housing, making it more affordable, ending discrimination, and ensuring that people aren't going bankrupt and falling into homelessness because of a medical emergency. So again, I really reject the idea that we have a silver bullet solution. And I'm also, as someone who grew up in public health, I see the intersectionality of our issues. People's lives don't operate in silos, neither should our policies.
I could go. Let me see. Solutions. So I changed my background from the Turner Center to the Blur background because I want to, it's just going to be me, not representing the Turner Center in any of these views, because I don't know if they wrote papers on this and I don't want to get in trouble. It's like my second month there. And it's my first panel. So solutions. Let's hit this. First, we need, there's always a bill that's being proposed every year for a rental registry by Assemblymember Wicks. As a constituent of her district, I'm a huge fan. We really need to track where are the rentals, how much they're charging, who are the landlords. We don't have that basic data. That is absolutely necessary if we need to like ensure and enforce certain laws, especially there's this bill, AB 1482, which passed 2 years ago and made it just cause evictions in California, and it limits to how much someone could raise rent. But we don't have anyone protecting tenants. We don't have a lot of tenant lawyers or tenant orgs. Join your local tenant union if it's there, or even just a right to counsel. I agree with Shervin. So we need the rental registry so that we can enforce the laws that we pass in the state. That's number one. Number two, we have to make it easier to build. Someone in the comments was talking about what if we build in the land sparse and then through a train in 30 minutes they like get to the large metro area. That is 100% the goal. The problem is that it's either you build the housing or you build the transit first. You have to convince a bunch, and transit's really expensive to build in America in general. So it's really hard to convince people to build trains in the middle of nowhere, which is like what they say about high-speed rail. The Central Valley is the fastest growing part of the state, and they all work in the Bay Area and LA. An hour train ride is a blessing compared to a 3-hour commute. We need to build trains, and we need to follow it with dense housing. Especially as someone from Stockton, California, the Turner Center published a report that around a huge portion of people from Stockton commute to the Bay Area every day. 30% of people just break even. And it's because there's a lack of jobs, and because they have to go through the Altima Pass, which is a 3-hour drive each way during rush hour. So that's 6 hours. I know Livermore suffers through this too. We're pushing workers out. It's harder to get across. But let me go back on the solutions. Mortgage interest deduction reform. That is 100% necessary. The biggest investment that the state does is to homeowners. If you get an MID, which is mortgage interest deduction, you get 4 tax breaks. You get 2 at the state level and 2 at the federal level. You get 2 because your primary home and your secondary home both get a tax break. What's a secondary home? Mostly vacation homes. State of California spends roughly $140 million to $250 million a year subsidizing empty housing units. What we can do is at least lift the subsidy and move that money to homeownership opportunities funded through the state, or to increase supply. Another way that we can increase supply is that the construction of an affordable housing unit in San Francisco costs $500,000 to build. An ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, which is now legal in the state to build, costs $156,000. So you could build 3 or 4 ADUs for the price of one affordable housing unit. And these ADUs could be placed in high opportunity areas. They don't mess with the neighborhood character, so they don't deal with NIMBYism. They're already legal, but we don't have the financing. So next month, the banking and housing committees are having a joint session on ADU financing. You as a citizen can view it. I think it's February 7th. Totally recommend just getting involved in that level. So we build more ADUs, we could start solving this housing crisis. And really, we need to uplift BIPOC developers and developers in general. This is a great way to build wealth and to build the necessary housing that we need to. We also need to empower and lift up more affordable housing developers, and we need to legalize affordable housing. Every year, California has like 100 bills trying to tackle the housing crisis. Pay attention, and when people show you these bills, please call your representative and tell them to support or oppose. They actually really listen to this sometimes, especially since I used to do stuff at the state level. They really listen. Your calls actually really do matter. And yeah, that's how much I'll talk to that problem. And I also, if we ever have a chance after Brittany speaks, I want to address some of the questions too, because we have like 22 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm just going to keep pushing the local issue. So the reality is that all those phone calls are important and they all matter. But what I see happen so often is that we get young people really excited and politically activated around these large federal issues. And we protest and we yell and we shout. And that is totally necessary. I'm not saying stop doing that, but you need to do that and start going to your local city council meetings. Start paying attention to who's running in those local races. Show up to your local Sierra Club meetings. This is something that happens a lot in the smaller chapters. So like that San Francisco Sierra Club is like pro affordable housing projects, but the local Sierra Club, that's the Tri-Valley, is funding these CEQA lawsuits constantly. And so you have in these smaller, more suburban communities, the people that show up to these meetings are retired, they are wealthy, and they are majority white. And that's the only voice that your local city council is hearing. And so what I am most proud of in my 1 year into this is every time a new person shows up to a council meeting, because I invited them, even if we don't agree on the actual policy decision, the fact is that it's a new voice added to that conversation. And if you go and look back years into policy decisions that have been made in my city specifically, and you look at the records of who's been making public comment, it's the same 24 people who have been commenting for decades because they are invested in that decision because they own a home here. And only homeowners' voices were considered to be valuable. And we need to start reminding people that just because you don't own a home in a community doesn't mean you're not invested in that community and that you can't build something great together as community members. And talk about the fact that you're a renter, and that's not a bad thing. That's something that I just happen to be, and so many other business owners are, and start showing up, because the reality is, one phone call from a constituent to me, I'm gonna pick up because it's just me, right? But when you do call a larger state person or a federal person, it's a telephone chain, right? And so you will get a direct answer from your local representative. So please show up. That's all I want you to do. Just show up to a council meeting. They're so boring sometimes, but I promise you, if you find one thing that you care about and you have a direct conversation with a local leader, they can walk you through some of that boring jargon. And then it's actually really interesting. But if you don't know all the acronyms, then you might go to sleep. So take a little bit of time, invest, and show up. It's totally worth it.
And I had my hand raised. I just wanted to say one thing. Well, to add on to Brittany's point, I had to call a bunch of offices, just schedule meetings today. Always got through it to a staff member. If you get to an intern, they will direct your call. And I forgot to address one question, which is UBI or guaranteed income. I used to work in Mayor Tubbs's office before when guaranteed income was being launched. Very familiar with the program. That's why I turned off the Turner background so I could talk about it because there's no formal position from the Turner Center on UBI because we're a housing org. But yeah, guaranteed income is absolutely necessary to help solve the housing crisis. We have to increase wages while we increase the housing supply, because the housing supply is going to take 20 years. And I'll pass it back to you, Brittany, just if you want to comment on UBI, because I felt bad not answering Sarah's question.
Oh yeah, I forgot to. So thank you for that. So UBI is something that I think a lot of people talk about as only lifting people out of poverty. Which obviously that's great. Like, why is that not good enough? But if you want to help people who are a little bit NIMBY and a little bit like, they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Something that I've been hearing a lot about from people is how it not only helps lift people out of poverty, it helps move people up a bracket, right? So right now we have just an increasing wealth gap, and you have folks who did everything right, like we were told to. We went to college, we took on a massive amount of debt to get a job that pays minimum wage. And now we're doing okay. I'm fine. I have 2 children, and I found an under market rental, and I just got lucky. But it would be nice if, I don't know, we had a savings account, and that would be cool. I'm not asking for wealth, but what the reality is, what UBI, which we all kind of experienced during the pandemic with those payments, if you were still employed, I was lucky to still be employed. My partner was still employed. All those extra relief payments ended up just kind of turning into UBI for us for a little bit, and those child payments. And we were able to have a savings account for the first time. And my car broke down twice in the pandemic. And for the first time ever, I was able to just pay for those car repairs and not take on more debt. And so UBI isn't just about like, let's make sure people can just pay their rent and buy food, but let's allow people to not take on more debt. to allow them to put a little bit of money aside to start a business. Let's allow them to put a little money aside. So when they want to do some shopping, you know what? Yeah, I can spend a little extra and buy at my local corner, my local shop downtown rather than buying on Amazon. Because a lot of times people are making decisions on what they buy, not because they actually want to support Jeff Bezos, but because it's the cheapest thing for them to do. And so it is all that money that we give, if it's not just getting people to the bare minimum, will go directly back into our local economies. And it's better for everybody. It's not, and this is a horrible thing to say, but I think so often what happens is it's like the poor versus everybody else. And if we talk about these issues as benefiting every level of the economy, then maybe we can stop that divisiveness of it's only the poor people need it and they're taking from us. It's everybody needs this. And here's how it will benefit all levels of the economy and how it will make us all better as a society together, not just righting the wrongs that are wrong, but increasing everybody's quality of life.
Thank you. We really appreciate having that perspective from each of you. With our remaining time, we definitely want to cover as much of the audience chat questions as we can. Before that, I just want to, every Policy Nerd Night, we always like to give our attendees a call to action. So really quickly, if each of you could just give, from as far as you're aware, any kind of initiatives or ways or opportunities that people can contribute to solving or at least improving this housing crisis, we'd love to hear them. Any of you could go first. Anything you can think of.
I'll jump in on this one. Mutual aid. Get involved in mutual aid in your communities. I think it's one of the greatest ways of building empathy and community solidarity to actually understand that when we take care of our neighbors, as Brittany was saying, all boats are lifted. We all prosper from it. Down here in LA, the mutual aid work we've done, I want to share one example of an encampment that was raided. It was a small encampment here in the San Fernando Valley. All the folks who lived in that encampment worked full-time in construction, which also breaks down one of the main stigmas and myths that unhoused folks don't work. All these folks worked. And I watched the city literally destroy not only homes, but chapels. The folks who lived there had built their own chapel, their own place of worship with their own bare hands. And the city demolished it. I remember the person who lived right next to that chapel, when he was walking out, just this look of demoralization on his face, where it was just saying, I'm late for work, I can't be here, and I gotta go. And when he came back, he had no home left. But I remember the one silver lining that day was there was a homeowner who was across the street. And up until that point, she had never met, never seen any of the folks who lived in that encampment, but she knew she didn't like them. For the first time, she actually saw behind those walls, saw what the folks there had built, and saw with their own two eyes what the city had did, criminalizing people's just basic survival. And she broke down in tears. She literally broke down. It opened her eyes, it opened her mind and her heart. And these situations, they do create opportunities at least to open people's minds and say, look, this is not the answer. Criminalization is not the answer. When we create opportunities to ensure everyone's basic needs are met, we all thrive, we all prosper, we all grow. And so that's my one take, is get involved in mutual aid. It builds not only your own personal connection to the community, but it also creates opportunities to get directly involved in civic action to ensure that everyone around us is being taken care of.
So I will jump in and say to each of you, look at your cities and go find the latest affordable housing project that has been approved. And if there isn't one, then call and ask why that is. You'll find that there probably are many cities that have affordable projects that are approved, but they are not yet built. And many of those throughout California are because of CEQA as a sword lawsuits. And talk about it. Ask those folks who are suing to stop development why, and keep having conversations. The reality is that until we start doing our own digging, we're not going to know why the housing problems exist in each of our individual locations. What's happening in Livermore is so different than what's happening in Berkeley, than what's happening in Pleasanton, that's what's happening in Dublin. And that's why it's really hard to find a silver bullet, right, to solve all of these issues. So what I think is the best to solve the issue in Livermore probably won't work next door because there are different leaders. And it's important for you to start thinking about who are the players in your community that control housing, and learn about them and what makes them tick and what do they really care about. Something that the people that are very anti-affordable housing in my area really care about is preserving open space. So start having those conversations about we can preserve open space by building up instead of out. And the conversation's not going so well so far, but it just started, right? So keep engaged in that conversation, because what I don't want people to get discouraged by is the fact that it feels like it's going to take forever, right? So this project that we're working on in downtown Livermore is older than I am. They've been working on this since before I was born, and we are still not able to break ground. That does not mean it's not worth fighting for, because hopefully by the time my children are my age, that will be a thriving community center hub of where our teachers and restaurant workers live. And maybe there's another project that I will start working on right now that will be close to being done. And I wish it could go faster. But the reality is that we shouldn't stop just because it's hard. It's going to take an entire generation of people to start paying attention to these local issues.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to jump into the Q&A session, and we only have about 10 minutes or so. So I'd like to jump into one from earlier, the California Comeback Plan. Did any of you have any thoughts on that, real briefly?
I'm looking it up because there's so many programs. Give me a minute.
No worries. In the meantime, let's jump into another question and then we can circle back. So this is kind of an interesting and new perspective. So the question reads, I'd be interested in the panelists' opinions on digital redlining and how our legal institutions are trying to adapt existing laws to the existing digitalization of the mortgage industry, and why that might look different than the traditional redlining we're used to hearing about. So do any of you have any opinions or thoughts on digital redlining, the digitalization of the mortgage industry, et cetera? Shervin, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah. Earlier today, I was reading an article about the iBuying that Zillow was engaging in all of last year, whereby they were selling these homes to institutional investors before they were even brought to the public market. And it was tens of billions of dollars worth of housing that single family homeowners were not able to, and if you were buying a home for the first time as a new couple, a new family, whatever it is, you are now competing with hedge funds. You are now competing with pension funds for that first home. So that's a huge, huge issue. And on top of that, we talked about the racial wealth gap in housing and how it's become so much worse as a result of the recession. It also has to do with, I put this in the chat, with the metrics that the federal government requires mortgage lenders to use. They require that classic FICO, which hasn't been updated since the 90s. And a lot of that FICO score prioritizes traditional credit, which white folks have a lot easier access to than anybody else. And you're not receiving further credits if you're paying your rent on time, if you're paying utilities bills on time, if you're paying whatever it is on time, you're not getting those extra credits. But if you miss a single payment, you're screwed forever. So all these things disadvantage low-income folks, people of color, and speaks to kind of the digitization of this industry. Whereas all these metrics, all these little buttons on computers where people just have no access to, and they're determining who gets a home and who doesn't.
If I could jump in real quick, I know there's more questions. Two things. Number one, Wall Street is banking on single family zoning because they know that property values are going to go up. So they bank on single family zoning for their investments, for their return. So now there's an investment by Wall Street to make sure that different types of housing are not getting built. Number two, when it comes to digitalization of mortgages, I just sent in the chat a 30-page report that I co-wrote specifically on this problem. There's this thing called the Community Reinvestments Act that was passed around the same time as civil rights legislation, where banks have to invest to low and moderate income communities. Fintechs or online bankers or non-bank lenders basically don't have to do CRA requirements. We don't have a lot of time, but let me just cut to the chase. Every 5 years, $100 billion, it's estimated, is not being invested to low to moderate income communities because of this loophole in the CRA. The CRA credits are mostly covered by banks by doing one or two things. Number one, I'm looking at the chat too much. Number one, by providing mortgages that the banks can't really they break even on to low to moderate income communities. Number two, by funding and constructing affordable housing. That's $100 billion nationwide every 5 years not reaching us because of the digitalization of mortgages. You can read the whole report there. I also dropped a few links on the Turner Center and a mutual aid thing, just in case anyone wants to check it out. But I'll pass it back to the facilitators, or unless Brittany wants to comment.
I do not have a specific comment about this, so I will move it back to Sarah.
Thank you guys. That was really interesting. And I actually definitely learned a lot about digital mortgages. So I'm going to be reading those papers, Mohammed. Thank you. Sean, do you have any more audience questions you'd like to pull?
I think we have time for one more. There's several here. Maybe we could talk about how do we balance the kind of regulation of housing, things like environmental standards with providing enough incentives to have enough supply. And I think this also, if we could loop in another question recently, I think this has to do with maybe a bit on zoning. I mean, if we have a housing crisis, why are we not just building as much housing as we possibly can? Why do we still approve, say, office projects?
I'll jump in. Okay, so this has to do with your local general plan, and please get involved with your local general plans. So many of them are up for rewriting in California within this next 5 years. So if it is a project that I would approve in Livermore, and it's not just city councils that do this. Your local planning commissions are also super important. So join your planning commission. That's usually an appointed position. So get to know your mayor or your council and get appointed to the planning commission and learn all about all this nerdy zoning stuff. So in Livermore, single family homes need 2 parking spaces. In Pleasanton, single family homes need 3 parking spaces. Why? That makes no sense. I don't think we need 2 parking spaces, but I'm known as the anti-parking girl in my town. So, we won't get into that. But the reality is we are neighbors, but to build a single family home even in Pleasanton requires so much more physical space than it does in Livermore. And that is all based on our general plans, the zoning documents that are so local. And there's not there's not a lot we can do about these parking requirements unless there is a state mandate. So, for example, the affordable housing in California we don't need to meet any parking minimums. but that really gets people fired up. So a lot of communities say, okay, we technically don't need to provide any parking, but we'll provide one parking per space or per unit, or 2 spaces per unit, or a half space per unit. They try and work with you. But when you look at the other regulations of not affordable housing, of regular apartment complexes or single family homes or duplexes or whatever, you see these very strange rules and you're like, why do we need 3 parking spaces? Or why does the fence need to be this high? And the reality is a lot of these are just to prevent more development. It's not actually because we think that people need 3 cars or 3 parking spaces. They're these small little pieces of legislation that you have control over in your local cities. Please pay attention to your general plan. That is my plea. I'm begging you.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. So I'm really sad to say that it's 7:31 and this panel has flown by. So I think we're going to start winding down, but I think this definitely warrants a follow-up conversation in some capacity in the future. But I just want to say to our attendees, thank you so much for calling in, for contributing amazing, thought-provoking questions. Thank you so dearly to Brittany, Shervin, and Mohammed for volunteering your time and sharing your insight and your experience with us about housing, transit, the environment, every intersectional issue. And so just a quick disclaimer, we are Policy Nerd Nights. We are a small educational series associated with Level Up California. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. And in doing so, we love to host open conversations about political matters. No one here is speaking on behalf of their employer. No one's representing anyone here. We're all just speaking from our hearts. So thank you all so dearly, so deeply. We're going to send out all these links as well as a link to the panel at the end of this conversation. Sean, is there anything else that you'd like to chip in?
It's been a pleasure having all of our panelists and attendees. Look forward to seeing you on next Policy Nerd Night.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. Shervin, Brittany, Mohammed, thank you so much and good luck with your endeavors.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.